Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this wonderful webinar that we have been working hard on. Difficult Decisions in Dangerous Times, Hope and Agency During the Armenian Genocide. I'm Michelle Herzog. I'm the History Social Science Coordinator for the Los Angeles County Office of Education. And I want to first of all thank the Genocide Education Project for doing a quick pivot. We were, going to do this as a face-to-face training. And thanks to their diligence and passion for this subject, we have converted it to this online webinar. So I'm very appreciative of their entire team, who you'll meet in a moment, for doing this and making this available. Thank you again. This is really difficult times we're going through, and for you to take the time to be part of this webinar says a lot about your professionalism, your integrity, and your priorities for your students and learning. So anyway, let me turn it over to Roxanne Makashjian. Thank you, Roxanne. She's the ringleader of this and been the lead on this project. So thank you, Roxanne, for stepping up and coming up with this plan to present this wonderful webinar.
Thank you, Michelle, very much. Thanks. Michelle has been, and the entire LACO has been wonderful partners for Gen Ed since we met last year. We actually met at a meeting of educators organized by the California Department of Education. The department has asked the Genocide Education Project to prepare a curriculum specifically aligned with the new social studies framework. And we're happily working on that project now with them. And Michelle didn't wait for that project to be done. She immediately jumped over and asked us to start providing full day workshops for LA County. We've done 2. We were going to do a 3rd recently last month, but we were glad to switch gears and do this one. But we hope we're going to meet all of you at a later date for a full day workshop. I want to tell you a little bit about Gen Ed. We've now been around for about 15 years. We're not just in California, but we provide workshops and materials and go to conferences, social studies conferences all over the country. Back in 1985 is when the California standards began to include the Armenian Genocide. Although some years later, when we asked teachers in school districts if they're teaching about it, they told us no, and we didn't blame them. They hadn't learned about the Armenian Genocide themselves. They didn't have any appropriate materials, age appropriate, grade appropriate, and this is a very sensitive topic, genocide. So, they wanted to be careful about how they approached it. So we understood all that, and I live in San Francisco, so we went to the San Francisco School Board and the school district, and they agreed with us, and we worked together over the course of a year to come up with our first basic fundamental set of lesson plans and do our full day workshop with them. It was very successful, so that's when we decided to make this a full-fledged nonprofit and expand as much as necessary to other school districts that were in need. I'm very happy to have our 2 Gen Ed specialists leading this off. I'm first going to turn it over to Sara Cohan. She's very special to us, and she's special to the whole arena of genocide education. She has a very deep personal and professional connection to genocide education. Her father, on her father's side, she's a descendant of a Holocaust survivor. On her mother's side, she's a descendant of the Armenian Genocide survivors. She has been a fellow at the U.S. Holocaust Museum, and since then has done loads of work regarding teaching about genocide, and in particular for the Genocide Education Project, teaching the modern era prototype, the Armenian case. So I'd like to turn it over now to Sara. Oh, Sarah's muted. Let's unmute Sara. There you go.
There we go. First technical issue down. Check that off. So I just want to start by just telling you a little bit about the workshop today. It's a little different than the way we usually handle workshops on this subject, and partially because of the time period we're in. Because we feel like, so teaching, as you know, teaching traumatic histories must be done in a way that carries both a sense of agency and not despair. It is a tightrope between teaching the truth about genocide and helping students find their voice to confront injustice in their own communities and globally. Today, finding that balance is even more challenging. We face a pandemic that impacts students personally, while human rights around the world are exploding almost as quickly. So today we're going to give you a brief history of the Armenian Genocide, but we're also going to look at two lessons that aren't as specific to the Armenian Genocide as generally we do, because we do think it's important that these lessons kind of bridge the concepts of genocide education and where we are today with the pandemic and ways of giving students a sense of agency in these difficult times. I'm going to turn it over now to Dikran, right? To discuss a brief history of the Armenian Genocide.
My name is Dikran Khaligian. I teach history at Worcester State University in Massachusetts, coming to you from Watertown, Massachusetts. And I'm going to give a brief history of the Armenian Genocide and of its denial to try to give the background and what the basics would be to teach about Armenian Genocide to students. Now, if you were to go to the United States Holocaust Museum in Washington, you'll find the following quote. Adolf Hitler, meeting at Obersalzberg at Berchtesgaden with his generals in 1939 in August, stated the following: I have given orders to my death head units to go into Poland and to eliminate every man, woman, and child of the Polish-speaking race. Only in this way will we obtain the Lebensraum, the living room that we require. And anticipating any concerns from his generals that how would we get away with this, he says, who, after all, speaks today of the Turkish annihilation of the Armenians? So it's interesting actually used to actually understand that Hitler understood the lessons of history better than some others do. And in fact, that's one of the things we try to teach. One of the reasons to teach more than one genocide is and the reason to teach genocide altogether is the only way to avoid future genocides is to make sure that past genocides are fully acknowledged and their consequences. There's justice for them before to avoid future perpetrators thinking, as Hitler did, is, well, they got away with it, maybe I can as well. So let's talk about the Armenian Genocide. First, let's talk who are the Armenians. The Armenians are an ancient people. How ancient? Well, just in recent years, the oldest winery in the world was found in today's Armenia at the town of Areni, an over 6,000-year-old winery. That gives you some idea how long the Armenians have lived in the Armenian highlands, the Armenian provinces. However, let's bring it up to more modern days. By the 1800s, the Armenians were split between two empires, the Russian Empire in the east and the Ottoman Turkish Empire in the west. And the genocide is going to take place on the Ottoman side. So let's discuss a little bit the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was a multi-ethnic empire. It was actually referred to as the sick man of Europe, because now for decades, the empire was coming apart, losing pieces one after the other to other powers, European powers. And at the same time, it had started lashing out. So the first massacres of Armenians took place in the 1890s under the then Sultan Abdul Hamid. Now the Armenians were, the Ottoman Empire was moving closer to Turkey during these years, closer to Germany during these years, and in fact had called in German generals to help reorganize their military. The Armenians in the meantime were quite different go back one please. The Armenians were in fact ethnically different. Well, first, the Armenians were the first Christian state in the world, starting in the 4th century, which distinctly made them distinct from the ruling Ottomans, because the Ottoman Empire itself was officially a Muslim empire. In fact, the Sultan, the emperor of the empire, was also the Caliph, the head of of Muslims worldwide. The Armenians have a unique language, and in fact a unique alphabet, as you can see. And so therefore, the Armenians within the Ottoman Empire were ethnically, religiously, linguistically different from the ruling group, and suffered discrimination and unequal treatment because of all its differences. They were clearly inferior judicially. They were inferior. They often had their lands confiscated. And in fact, if they even appealed to the judicial system, say to get their land back, the testimony of a Christian, of a non-Muslim, was not valued the same in Ottoman courts as the testimony of a Muslim. So if it was a Muslim who was confiscating those lands, the Armenians were out of luck, as were other Christians in the empire. So this is the situation within the Ottoman Empire at this time. But then in 1908, you had a change in the empire, where a new party, the Young Turk Party, a group of revolutionaries who actually were working with Armenian revolutionaries to overthrow the Sultan, this despotic Sultan, was actually successful in a constitutional revolution in 1908. At that time, they restored the constitution and, in fact, created a multi-ethnic empire that, parliament, that Armenians, Greeks, Arabs, all the different ethnic groups actually took part in. And there actually was hope now that you would actually have equal rights within this new empire. However, as soon as the Young Turks came to power, they started losing parts of their empire. You can see from the map that's displayed now, they've been losing it now for over a century, but now the blue areas, they start losing as well, as the European empires start grabbing pieces because they sense the Ottoman weakness. Whether it be first Bosnia, then the Italians invade Libya, and finally then the Balkan countries, small nations of the Balkans that had long been part of the Ottoman Empire, actually started a war and defeated the Ottoman army, which was a huge blow to the Young Turks and caused their own internal political opposition to start trying to undermine them. In addition, there were uprisings in the Arab provinces. So as we approach 1914, you see the yellow area is where the Ottoman Empire was, but they fear losing all the southern parts, those Arab provinces as well. This was the situation, and this caused a radicalization within the Young Turks that were ruling the Ottoman Empire. And so how did this radicalization take place? Basically, the chauvinist, ultra-nationalist faction within the Young Turks defeated the more pluralist, reformist faction, and finally stepped forward and had a coup d'etat in 1913 because they'd briefly lost power, had a coup d'etat, established a military dictatorship, and decided to ignore the constitution. So this multi-ethnic parliament no longer mattered. You no longer had a reformist Ottoman Empire. You now had a military dictatorship, and it was becoming very Turkish nationalist. And what now that the Young Turks had come to this, and this is really the why of the Armenian Genocide, why did they take place? They realized, looking at the map that we just had, in this map you see now, the same areas they've been losing is the dotted line you see there. They saw we're losing our Ottoman Empire. The idea of having a pan-Islamist empire unified by the religion of Islam isn't working, because even some of the Muslims are rising against us, like the Arabs. We need to create something new. And so they developed this ideology of pan-Turkism or pan-Turanism. Let's unite all Turkic peoples. Who are Turkic peoples? People who speak a language similar to Turkish, who are ethnically Turkic. And if you look at the map, you see it in the orange. Basically, those areas are the lands to the east of Turkey. First Azerbaijan, then Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, etc. So the idea is we can recreate our empire. We can have a new greater empire, a pan-Turkic empire, but we need to move into Russia. Because the thing that had always prevented the Turkish Ottoman Empire from advancing to the east was the great power of the Russian Empire. But now, things were different. It's 1914. We're working with the German army, the great German army. If the Turks, the Young Turks believe Germany will help them defeat the Russian Empire, defeat the Russian army. This will allow us now to expand and create our great pan-Turkic empire. This was the actual ideology of the Young Turk Party. One obstacle, though, between mainland Turkey and the Turkic empires, sitting smack in the middle between them, are the Armenians. This map shows the extent of Armenia during different parts of its history, but what you can see is they are a physical obstacle between the Turks of Turkey and all the Turkic peoples to the east. And so therefore, the Young Turks decided they're going to have to be eliminated. They're going to have to be removed from that area, if not exterminated, for us to be able to create our new empire. And this was the why of the Armenian Genocide. What better time to conduct, as you might guess, most genocides take place during war. Wartime would be the best time to implement such a plan. So therefore, in August of 1914, 2 days before the start of World War I, Ottoman Turkey signs a secret agreement with the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, to join the war on their side against the Allied powers. What's their first step? Well, in December of 1914, Enver Pasha, who was the Minister of War and who had actually had learned in Germany about military tactics, decides to start his great offensive. Unfortunately for Enver, he didn't seem to understand the history of Napoleon's invasion of Russia, or even the movie The Princess Bride, where they say, don't start a land war in Asia in winter. He decides to invade Russia in December. He sends his Third Army, and in the Battle of Sarıkamış, loses 80% of his army. Unbelievable casualties, most of whom didn't even die in combat, but actually froze to death because it was December and they didn't provide them with winter clothing. Because of this defeat, the final radicalization of the Young Turks takes place. They decide now is the time, yes, we have to eliminate these Armenians, even though they had actually served in the army, Ottoman army for them. We're going to have to eliminate them. Let's implement this plan because our own invasion of Russia has failed so miserably. So therefore, in February of 1915, the first step is taken. All the Armenians who had joined the Ottoman army and were fighting for Ottoman Turkey were disarmed, formed into labor battalions, and basically treated like pack mules, and would eventually be murdered, shot, bayoneted, etc. Then orders went out to disarm all Armenian civilians, collect all arms, etc. This now would set the stage. Now, most of the young men are now dead. They've been exterminated because they were in the army. Now let's get rid of the leadership of the Armenian community. So on April 24th, 1915, which is the date that Armenians commemorate, April 24th being the date that Armenians commemorate the Armenian Genocide each year, as we do this year on Friday, 300 Armenian leaders, intellectuals, political leaders, religious leaders, educators, etc., are rounded up in the capital city of Constantinople, marched into the east, most of whom will never be heard from again. They'll be almost all will be murdered. Now the leadership of the community has been decapitated. Now the next steps can be taken. So now we're going from the why of the Armenian Genocide to the how. Orders go out. This is a ciphered order. Orders go out and to actually explain what the steps going to be taken in order to implement this genocide. And the reason why we're able to say that this was clearly not happenstance, it just didn't happen, things happened during wartime, which is one of the arguments made by the Turkish government, is because the pattern of extermination is repeated everywhere. In hundreds and hundreds of villages and towns across the Ottoman Empire, some of them hundreds of miles away from each other, we see the same pattern of extermination. First, an order is given that all able-bodied men remaining in the towns and villages, those who haven't joined the military, are ordered to report to the town square. They are immediately jailed and within a day or two are marched out of town to then be shot or bayoneted. So now all the able-bodied men are gone. A few days later, another order comes. All those remaining, who's remaining? Women, children, the elderly, are now ordered to report again to town hall to gather whatever possessions they can carry for relocation because of the war. Now, the orders that we see there are basically coming from this military junta, this triumvirate of the three leaders of the Young Turk Party and of the government now. Enver Pasha, the war minister, Talat Pasha, the interior minister, Cemal Pasha, the naval minister. Now, in case anyone's confused, Pasha is not a name. It's an honorific. It's a title. There were no last names in the Ottoman language among Ottomans at this time, so it's the first name in Pasha. They're the ones who actually issued the order. These three are the key figures in giving the orders and in implementing the Armenian Genocide, and it's those orders that you just saw in coded form just before. We have some photographic evidence of the Armenian Genocide, and about the only reason we do is because, as we stated, Turkey and Germany were allies, and one German medic, Armin Wegener, secretly, because he could have been shot for doing this, took photographs across the Ottoman Empire as the genocide was taking place. So when I show you photographs shortly, they are almost entirely Armin Wegener's photographs that he did at great risk to his own life. This is the scene in one of the villages. People, round up people, murder people who might be a problem. Now we gather all the women, the children, and we start marching them out of town. These are the deportations. They are marched in hundreds of miles, either towards the nearest river, where they're tied together and drowned, or the vast majority are marched south, ever further south, into the deserts of Syria and Iraq. Some of these villages and towns were hundreds and hundreds, if not over 1,000 miles away from the battlefront. But that is part of the deception, part of the cover-up to the genocide that the Young Turks actually were putting together as they were implementing it. Along the way, they are attacked by their guards. They are attacked by brigands, by Kurdish bands. Basically, the guards allow those who are supposed to protect them actually allow, if not take part in the attacks. Those who cannot, are die of exposure or starvation on the way. Those who cannot keep marching are killed or bayoneted and left to die. Anyone who can't march, who can't continue, is killed. And this goes on for hundreds and hundreds of miles. This map, basically, you can see the size of the red circles proportionate to the population. And as you'll note from what I said earlier, the battlefront is all the way to the east, and some of these locations are over 1,000 miles from that battlefront. So now they're all marched. Those who are near the Black Sea were actually taken to the Black Sea and drowned there, but everyone else is marched south into the deserts, particularly as you'll see all the way to the deserts in the north of Syria, near the town of Deir Zor. Those who actually survive, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, have died on the way. Those that survived all the way to Deir Zor are now rounded up into basically primitive concentration camps. They're left there. They're hoped they're going to be, they'll die of starvation, because if they haven't already starved on the way there. But even that is not enough. There is not able to completely eliminate these Armenians, this obstacle to the Young Turks. And so, in fact, primitive gas chambers are set up where they are herded into caves near the town of Deir Zor. Fires are lit at the mouth of the caves, and the people inside asphyxiate. This is the pattern that we see from across the Ottoman Empire, and we see this pattern of extermination, this systematic plan that shows the premeditation and the fact there were centralized orders. Now, there were a few locations where the Armenians learned, because there were massacres elsewhere, people were, word got there. There were a handful of locations where there were some resistance, where they tried to fight back and prevent their population being deported and murdered, all but two of which ended up being unsuccessful. But these are the different parts of the Armenian Genocide. Now, I should also note, Armenians were not the only ones who were exterminated in this way. Basically, Why were the Armenians targeted? Because they were not Muslim and they spoke a different language, and they were not Turkish. They were ethnically different. Well, the other areas that Armenians were concentrated, this was going to be done to Armenians. But there were also areas of the Ottoman Empire where Greeks and Assyrians, other Christian peoples that were ethnically different, were in heavy concentration. They also were deported and exterminated in this genocide in the hundreds of thousands. So the Armenian genocide, when we stated, also included others as well. But what we can say, and this map shows, by the end of 1916, almost all the massacres were complete of this initial stage. More than 1 million were dead. About 250,000 had managed to escape to Russia, including one of the successful resistances in Van. They were rescued by advancing Russian troops. They escaped to Russia. Another 400,000 survived in the Arab provinces. 200,000 more were forcibly Islamized and adopted by Turkish or Kurdish families. But this is not the last stage of the Armenian genocide. Very briefly, in 1918, there would be a Turkish invasion of Eastern Armenia, the part that was part of the Russian Empire, and another 100,000 Armenians would be murdered at that time. And even then again, in 1919 to 1922, after the war, when the French occupied southern Armenia, the area nearest the Mediterranean, the French would eventually pull out. The Armenians that had returned, because they were under French protection, another 250,000 Armenians would be massacred then. In all, from 1915 to 1923, over 1.5 million Armenians would be killed. This is the Armenian genocide. At this time, I'll pause for a minute. Roxanne, if there are any questions, I can cover that before we move on.
Very often we end up kind of seeing claims that sound very much like Turkish denial. The Turks did this because there was a real threat of revolution or revolt. And I wanted to hear what you had to say about that.
Sure. Yes, basically, I mean, as I stated, the cover-up for this genocide was actually being done as they were implementing it. And so this phony story of an Armenian rebellion, they actually set up in the initial stages. So for instance, I talked about the Armenian civilians being disarmed. Well, the way this was done, they put out an order saying that we want all your weapons, all your hunting rifles, all your guns, your pistols, etc., and all your ammunition. But they didn't just say all of them. They actually gave a quota to every town and village. This is how much you have to turn over. In fact, in some cases, to avoid being killed right up front, they actually had to buy additional guns just to have enough to turn over. What did the Turkish government and the Young Turks do? They took photographs of all the Armenian men of the village behind all these weapons to say, this is what we confiscated from them. Those photographs have reappeared in the last 30 years in the books published by the handful of apologist authors who claim that, yes, this wasn't a genocide, it was self-defense by the Ottoman Empire. Look at all these weapons that the Armenians had, but all those weapons were confiscated. So, I mean, they try to display it as a civil war, but this was all part of the cover story that the Young Turks were actually creating as they implemented the genocide. Let me go forward, and again, addressing, in fact, Roxanne's concern as well, where do we have evidence of what happened? Well, a large portion of the evidence actually comes from the United States, the National Archives in Washington. Because the thing we have to recall, the United States won't enter World War I until 1917. So back in 1915, the United States is still a neutral power. Ambassador Henry Morgenthau is in Constantinople, and his memoirs, Ambassador Morgenthau's story, are in fact one of the best sources on what happened in the Armenian genocide, because not only did he have his own eyewitness where he actually met numerous times with the Minister of the Interior, Talat Pasha, the main perpetrator, one of the three perpetrators of genocide. Not only did he have that, but he had all the reports from his different consuls who were in different parts of the Ottoman Empire, different towns, and he was constantly receiving, and you can go to the British American archives and see all these reports he was receiving of what was happening to Armenians in different parts of the empire. So from 1915 to 1917, the Americans in the empire, plus American missionaries who were also writing to him, compiled much of this information. Because of it, the New York Times actually, if you go to the archives of the New York Times, has huge number of articles about what was about the Armenian Genocide. In fact, as it was occurring, there were more articles in the New York Times about the Armenian Genocide than there were about the Holocaust while it was happening, because as you know, there weren't neutral powers to report about the Holocaust. The Nazis didn't allow them to be around Auschwitz or anywhere else, where they are available if you go to the archives of the New York Times. Because of this great attention to what happened by American officials and all the coverage in the American press, in fact, a huge charitable movement took place in order to rescue the survivors, those who managed to survive the Armenian Genocide. The American Committee for Relief in the Near East, now known as Near East Relief, collected tens of millions of dollars. In fact, this is the first, in American history, it was the first international humanitarian effort by the United States anywhere in the world. And we actually have, the Gen Ed has available for you a curriculum just on American efforts for Near East relief, for the survivors of the Armenian Genocide. That's available. It's one of the lesson plans that you can actually teach from. Everybody took place. Jackie Coogan, the child actor who acted with Charlie Chaplin, had organized his own ship to ship supplies to the survivors of the Armenian Genocide. So that is what happened after the genocide. It was an international issue. It was a major issue here in the United States. That's one of the angles you can use in order to teach about the Armenian Genocide. But let's fast forward a little bit to the end of World War I. As you know, the Central Powers will be defeated. The Ottoman Empire is conquered, but the main perpetrators of the genocide, including Talat, Enver, and Cemal, all escape. With German assistance. They're actually smuggled out of Constantinople by submarine, and they all escaped to Europe. However, the Armenians followed them, and Talat Pasha, for instance, 2 years later will be assassinated by an Armenian engineering student in Berlin. He doesn't try to escape after assassinating him. He allows himself to be captured, and he's actually put on trial. It was a spectacular trial in Weimar, Germany, and gets international attention. And his defense was, my entire family was wiped out under the orders of Talat Pasha and the Young Turks, and therefore it's justified. And in the end, he will be acquitted by the German court as justifiable homicide, his assassination of Talat Pasha. Interesting thing that comes out of this is one of the people reading about the news coverage of this trial was Raphael Lemkin, a Polish Jewish lawyer who is struck by the testimony that was given in this court. And when the Holocaust will take place in World War II, he will, number one, create the word, which never existed before. The word genocide was his creation based on the two examples that as he writes about the Armenian Genocide and the Holocaust. And in fact, he would then write the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide. So the UN law concerning genocide was written by Raphael Lemkin, and his two prototypes were the Holocaust and the Armenian Genocide. How else can we teach about genocide? Well, one of the important things are the 10 stages of genocide. This is another lesson plan that's available to you, created by Dr. Gregory Stanton of the International Association of Genocide Scholars. The usefulness of this is that it shows the commonalities between different genocides, that there actually are common factors, and by looking at the different steps, you can actually realize that there are many things in common, and this makes it easier for people to relate that each case is not, while they might be different, each case is not unique in that there are many commonalities. First, you have to classify people. It's us versus them. These people are different. Then in the different genocides, you see different types of symbolization that take place. The discrimination, which we spoke about earlier today, is key. Dehumanization, this you'll see in all genocides. So that's one of the lesson plans that's also available to you. I won't get into any more of the detail, but to get us to the 10th step, the last step, is that of denial. And this is especially important when we speak when we speak of the Armenian genocide, because it is the only genocide that has an international campaign of denial conducted by a government that takes place. And so therefore, let's talk a little bit about denial. This is also something that I find very useful for my students in trying to bring it up to the present day, because one of the main battlefields in Armenian genocide denial is the United States. So there are many tactics of denial. You'll see them in not just the Armenian case, but especially in the Armenian case, some of the different ways that the Turkish government and their apologists tried to deny the genocide. One unique aspect of this actually came in the 1930s, because after the genocide, the Austrian Jewish author, novelist Franz Werfel wrote a novel about one of the only two cases of successful resistance to the genocide. Basically, he wrote the novel called The 40 Days of Musadag, which talked of a number of Armenian villages that banded together, fought off a Turkish army on a mountainside, and were eventually rescued by French and British ships on the Mediterranean. This book became an international bestseller, was translated into a couple dozen languages, and what's the next thing we do after, when you have such a big bestseller, you turn it into a movie. But if you're to go on IMDb or Netflix now and look for the 40 Days of Musadag, you won't see it. Because even though MGM bought the rights to the novel and was ready to produce it, I'm not sure who was going to act, who the actors would be, but we can wonder. The Turkish, and this is again, 1930s, the Turkish Foreign Ministry contacted the United States State Department. The United States State Department contacted Louis B. Mayer, the head of MGM, and explained to him that it was not in the United States' interest to have this movie produced, because Turkey was a potential ally with lots of resources and bordered the Soviet Union. So therefore, this movie was killed. One prominent case of the Turkish government denial. We see many others going right up to the present day in laws within Turkey, threats against foreign governments, anyone who might consider, any government that wants to pass a resolution recognizing the Armenian genocide, which dozens of countries have, the Turkish government acts against them. As you know, Turkey, being a NATO ally, for decades leveraged its membership in NATO in order to try to prevent the United States from recognizing the genocide. And speaking of the Armenian genocide, the different areas, genocide denial actually spreads into many areas. And that's one of the things that makes it so pernicious. It isn't just legislative, it's not just Congress, but it reaches into universities where there are those who publish books denying the Armenian genocide, a handful of professors who take the Turkish government aligned. It goes into schools and state legislatures where there have actually been lawsuits funded by, indirectly funded by the Turkish government to prevent any states from having genocide, Armenian genocide included in Holocaust and genocide curricula. The state of Massachusetts was sued. Case was eventually dismissed, but sued because of its inclusion of the Armenian genocide. But of course, Congress has been one of the main battlefields. Resolutions on the Armenian genocide passed in 1975, passed in 1984, but for 3 decades thereafter, attempts to continue to do so failed. Fortunately, recent actions by Turkey in northern Syria, where they actually have attacked America's best ally, the Kurds, changed the atmosphere in Congress. And just last December, the United States House, by a vote of, I think, 410 to 9, and the United States Senate unanimously both acknowledged the history that is in the United States archives, that of course there was an Armenian genocide, Of course, America has had many parts of its government speak to this genocide, and it's time that we stop allowing Turkey to dictate that we can't. If you actually go to Turkey, this is a street sign, Talat Pasha Street. In one of the, you'll see Talat Pasha streets across Turkey. His body was brought back from Germany during World War II and as a place of honor in a mausoleum. I've been to Germany 4 or 5 times myself. I've never seen an Adolf Hitler Boulevard or a Heinrich Himmler Street. This shows how far this denial goes, that they're willing to actually acknowledge a genocide perpetrator. And in fact, the only monuments you'll find in Turkey regarding what happened were actually monuments that claim it was the Armenians who committed genocide against the Turks. So to wrap things up, there are a number of different ways to teach about the Armenian genocide, to teach the history, and even teach the contemporary relevance, both through the different lesson plans we have. And denial is one of the key ways to do that, to say, this is what's happening today and something that you can actually take part in, understand, and try to bring the historical truth to the forefront.
As you probably know, April is not just the month for the commemoration of the Armenian Genocide, but it's also known as Genocide Awareness Month, because generally speaking, Yom HaShoah, which is Holocaust Remembrance, falls within April. It was actually Monday evening to Tuesday evening this week. So does the anniversary for the Cambodian Genocide, for Rwanda, and for Darfur. And so something really interesting, kind of a sociological, one of many sociological phenomena has happened this month, which is that generally when these groups of people, Armenians, Jews, etc., have an opportunity to meet together and memorialize and remember their ancestors and their pain in diaspora, they haven't had the chance to do that because of social isolation, and it causes a real shift in how we handle ourselves as a community. Those physical memorials that we gather around almost become the take the place of the country that our families were removed from. And so in that dynamic, not being in those spaces, even though they're not truly our homelands, but not being in those spaces with our memorials and together in those time periods is really taxing for a lot of groups. And of course, there's a million other things that are really taxing for people at this time. But this reminds me of William Stroyan was a famous Armenian writer and lived in Fresno, and he had an amazing quote that I wanted to share just the last part of it with you, because I think it really speaks to memorialization. He says, "Go ahead, destroy Armenia. See if you can do it. Send them into the desert with bread or water. Burn their homes and churches. Then see if they will not laugh, sing, and pray again. For when 2 of them meet anywhere in the world, see if they will not create a new Armenia." And so it's that idea that when people are in diaspora and they come together, they in a sense recreate what was lost in genocide. And again, so that's particularly important in having that physical memorial space. And so I'm going to show you all a film right now that talks about a memorial that was designed for the 100th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide.
I remember my grandparents telling me when we were children all these stories, but no one ever talked about the genocide. We all felt the burden of the unspoken. I remember as kids, breakfast one day, we were making pancakes for my grandparents, and my grandfather was joking how this was like what they would feed the camels. And as he started to talk about the old country and the genocide, who wants pancakes? My grandmother got very flustered and said, "Mugurdich, don't tell those stories." My name is Michael Aram. I'm an Armenian American, designer of objects and metal for the home. A lot of what I do comes from my heritage. One of the things I love is that objects made by hand have a soulfulness. they trace history. I don't think I could have ever dreamt of a life more fulfilling than mine, or that so many people would appreciate my work. I'd been thinking about what I could make to honor the history of my forefathers. My partner, Adet, turned to me and said, "Why don't you do something for the 100th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide?" So I'm creating a sculpture called Migrations. My grandmother was from Kharpert. They were merchants trading carpets and clothing. When the genocide started, hundreds of thousands of families were uprooted. They had to flee their homes. Others were sent on death marches into the desert. Some witnessed the entire slaughter of their families. My grandmother spoke of how she had to eat her jewelry, swallow her coins, how she escaped by being rolled up in an Armenian carpet and put on a caravan. She lived in ditches, gutters, and safe houses, until finally, 7 years later, she was able to get on a ship from Marseille to the United States. She could have only survived with the help of a lot of people. Birds as a symbol was almost instinctive for me. Birds have historically been used as symbols of the genocide. There's a sense of fleeing, confusion, clusters of families, some shrieking, some as if they're not alive. At the very top, birds with their wings outstretched like crosses, with the idea of either salvation or ascension. The body of the piece is high-polished stainless steel, referencing, in my opinion, the greatest Armenian artistic achievement, our khachkars, a large cross carving on a rectangular stone. But mine is cracked in the shape of historic Armenia, and the country is on its side, like it's been emptied.
You know, my heart is full of emotion for who we are today and the incredible debt that we owe our ancestors.
It's a multiple migration for me. A migration of place, of spirit, of living to dead, of dead now to canonization. It's funny how fiercely proud we are to be Armenians. I think we get much of that through our grandparents and what they went through to maintain and propagate their identities here in America.
There you go.
I grapple with how to teach my kids about the genocide. One of the reasons I created this sculpture was to be able to share that story with my children, but do it in a way that's very positive. As we stand in front of the piece, I'll be able to say, look at your reflection. Look at us here, now, today, as products of our grandparents' journey. We honor that migration.
this sentiment on this slide is a little bit like I was already talking about before the film. Identity and memorials, and basically representing memories through public memorials not only reminds people of their history without actually visiting a place specifically, but it also provides a personal connection and strengthens collective memory. And so it's a really important part of the process. Many of you might be familiar with this quote, and others have used it as well. Walter Benjamin wasn't the only person who coined this, but he was a victim of the Holocaust and a philosopher, a sociologist. And he states that history is written by the victors, and it's not just written by the victors, but it's recorded in various ways by the victors. And so in this situation, we have memorials like the World War I Memorial in Washington, D.C., which is an example, and not necessarily a negative example, but an example of a memorial created by the victors. We have a sadder example here of a memorial created by victims. This is the new lynching memorial in Montgomery, Alabama, a portion of it. And so it's an incredibly powerful memorial that went up 2 years ago. And this is, and memorials also, they form our view of history. What we see around us in our physical space tells us who's important enough to be remembered. And this is not a particularly significant memorial to anybody but people like myself. And it's Ataturk who took over and created the Republic of Turkey. He is usually given like quite a bit of accolades for creating a secular society, but he only does that after removing the Armenians, the Greeks, and the Assyrians that were not killed under Ottoman rule. This particular memorial is in a city called Mersin in Turkey, and it was the last city that my family, the few remaining members of my Armenian family, were in before they took a boat to Lebanon. And since that point, that was the last time my family had feet on their historic homeland. So memorials, they get to that universality of the story. They're things that so many of us can relate to, and they define our physical and psychological space in a community, and they're objects which we can use as teachers to explore and discuss while covering standards, curriculum, and literacy, different ways of basically reading society. So we look at what is the purpose of memorialization. I mean, one is providing solace for survivors. One example of this is the Mount Davidson Cross in San Francisco. Again, usually on Friday this week, Armenians in San Francisco would be gathered around this cross to remember their ancestors who died in the Armenian Genocide. This is the Armenian Genocide Memorial in Armenia itself. This is this memorial represents more of a human rights issue. It's Comfort Women Memorial. It's in Glendale. Memorials can also represent transitional justice. And so oftentimes when a society is conflicted, when they are getting over significant conflict, memorials help to create pathways for people to come back together. And so Kigali Memorial Center is an example of that in Rwanda. Another example of this is the Southern Poverty Law Center Memorial in Montgomery, Alabama. And this also provides a place in which people can meet and discuss civil rights issues, look at contemporary issues of hate, and kind of find that moment of peace when the building is not being bombed. The building behind what you see was actually bombed in the 90s. Memorialization is also also social activism. what we choose to present tells our political motives for good and bad. This is a really interesting memorial that I have a picture of. It's actually a digital memorial, which is, I think, kind of a really clever new era or a territory for memorial creating that your students could really embrace. And so this is the stories from Guantanamo Bay. Memorials are not always creating positive histories. You have historical revisionism oftentimes found in your memorials. This particular memorial, this is a picture of a stormtrooper in front of a memorial by Nathan Bedford Forrest. He was the founder of the Klan. And this was in Memphis, Tennessee. It was only removed 6 months before the 50th anniversary of MLK's assassination. So it took 50 years to after MLK's assassination in Memphis to have this removed. And actually currently in Nashville, it's still, Nathan Bedford Forrest is still in the Capitol. Here's another example of revisionist history in Hungary. And if you've watched the news at all during this virus, Hungary has just turned to a dictatorship. The head of Hungary, now the dictator of Hungary, Orban, used the opportunity for crisis to take over the country in a form of dictatorship. He last year he had a museum built that essentially encapsulates Holocaust denial. This memorial has been along longer than Orban, but it represents denialism, and it's tricky because basically what it says is shoes on the side of the Danube River, and Jews were lined up and shot into the river. And it says, to the memory of the victims shot into the Danube by the Arrow Cross militiamen. It doesn't say who the victims were. Part of revisionist history in Hungary is denying the Hungarian Christians' role in the supporting the Arrow Cross and the Nazis. And the only way one can assume that the victims were Jewish is by the third plate, which is written in Hebrew. As Dick Ron pointed out, examples of denialist memorials are erected throughout Turkey. There are not memorials to the Armenian Genocide, but instead, like this one, built to the, quote, victims of the genocide against the Turks by the Armenians. Within our own country, we have examples of denialist memorials. The National Museum of the American Indian, not one place in the museum is the word genocide included. This is a form of revisionism history, that we have incorporated into our landscape. And so what we can do with this, in terms of like where your students are today, is they can look around, and of course they can't physically look around their communities right now, but they can search by web and identify a memorial in their community. And then just answer some basic questions about it. Even, you could even go on to ask them, like, have they even noticed this memorial before? Oftentimes, like I assume in Glendale, where the Comfort Women Memorial is, that oftentimes students probably walk by it on a regular basis and don't know what it represents and what it stands for. And so, have them analyze who did it, what was the motivation, why is it appropriate for the community that you are currently living in, and if it was up to you, but what might you change? And then ask them to how they might create a memorial for the pandemic. Right now, they're, as you know, in a situation where they're just receiving a lot of information, a lot of agony. They may be sick, their families may be sick, they may have lost a parent, a grandparent, they may be hungry, they might be in an abusive home. There are so many things going on in their lives that are tragic, and they're thinking about, like, how are people going to remember the pain that I'm in right now? And so I think that an exercise in creating a memorial will help them have an outlet for thinking about, how this will be remembered, and that it will be remembered. Their pain will be remembered. We have a memorial lesson on the Armenian Genocide that you can find on our website, and in a quote packet of materials I'm going to give you at the end of the lesson via a Google Drive. And this memorial lesson is where it's a wonderful story about a man who, well, it's a sad story, but he was a botanist and in the Ottoman Empire, Armenian, and he identified a particular type of tulip that was exported to Holland. When the Armenian Genocide hit, he was imprisoned. He was fortunate in that he was able to escape. He eventually came to Michigan, and but like my family and so many others, never was able to return to his homeland. Interestingly enough, the tulip that he identified also no longer exists in Turkey, but thrives in outside of its historic roots. And so, much like the tulip, Armenians, regardless of what was tried, what the Turkish government tried to do to them, we are flourishing and growing in diaspora, just like the tulips. So it's a simple activity for kids to do. They could put the tulips on their windows. They could there's lots of ways in which they could do it without being outside that could be modified for this time. And then the last little lesson area I want to look at is agency in ordinary people. And so agency is the capacity of individuals to act independently and make their own free choices. I think it's one thing that we desperately need to give to our students right now is an opportunity to feel like they have some level of control over their lives. And we can do this by also teaching them about primary sources. Because as we know, primary sources are materials that directly relate to a topic by time or participation, including letters, speeches, photos, diaries, newspapers, etc. And those pieces of testimony, they create a sense of identity, community membership. They also can bring out issues of shame, pride, and resilience when we read these stories and these documents from an era. Dick already mentioned Armin Wegner. He was a photographer, a German medic and photographer in the Armenian Genocide. He's a great example of an ordinary person who made a simple but profound decision while he was a medic in the army. He knew that by holding on to film, that if he smuggled out film, he would be providing documented evidence of what was happening to Armenians for generations. And his photographic evidence is some of the most important documents that we have as Armenians. But he goes beyond that. He is kind of one of the most extraordinary people in history. Armin Wegner was German, and in 1933 was actually arrested for sending a letter to Hitler calling for the end of the discrimination of Jews. By 1933, you start seeing laws being put into place that were targeted at Jews, the rise of Hitler as a dictator, and Wegner knew too well where this was going. He wrote a letter asking, he was the only writer at the time, he was also a writer and a poet and not just a medic, but he wrote a letter at the time. He was one of the few writers who did, and was imprisoned for it. He was placed in multiple concentration camps, he was tortured, and after surviving the Holocaust, he spent the rest of his life in exile in Italy. There are other ways of making courageous decisions. One is the power of the word. This woman, Aurora Mardiganian, she escapes from the Armenian Genocide. And if you look at this quote I have on the side here, it ends by her saying, "I had at last reached the country where I was to deliver the message that was to bring help to my people." And so she purposely she wanted to get the word out to her, like telling others her experiences would be completely transform what she would hope would bring more help and notice to the struggle of Armenians. And so she, with the help of a ghostwriter, wrote a book called Ravished Armenian, the story of Aurora Mardiganian. And through her book and later film, she was able to bring a tremendous amount of relief, charitable relief and attention to the Armenian cause. So then I have a couple little short pieces that we're going to send to you all. We can send to you all later, and these short pieces could be used if you want to use like short springboards for looking at actions people take in desperate times. This woman Dalita, she gave, actually for this project, she gave me part of her family story, which is very simple, that her grandfather paid a Turkish soldier to unlatch a boxcar so that her family could escape. And he paid money to this Turkish soldier. But of course, the soldier could take the money and not unlock the car, but instead he did. And he was able to, so Dalita's family was able to survive by the simple action of leaving a door unlocked. Oneg, if anyone's familiar with the Oneg Shabbat archive, it's an incredible story from the Holocaust where residents of the Warsaw Ghetto recorded their history, the things that were going on at the time in the ghetto. They were putting them in milk cans and burying them underneath the buildings. These were later excavated. I think out of the group, I don't remember, I think it was like 2 people survived, and they were able to help later archaeologists come back and find these milk cans that contain these incredible documents about life in the Warsaw Ghetto. And that is an incredible action taken. It's agency, because the idea was that people may die, but the world is going to know what happened to them. And so the Oneg archives are an incredible example of a group of people, by just collecting their experiences, documented for the world what happened to Jews during in the Warsaw ghettos. So I'm going to skip this one by, and so then we can even go to just a very simple one. I mean, these are the kind of actions that honestly we want our students to take right now. So this was in the New York Times, and it was just a sweet little note that a 10-year-old girl left on her neighbor's door. And I think that's an action that can bring hope and love to a community. It's community positive, and it's simple, and nothing's on the line. And I think one thing for students to think about is that by staying, inside and following these rules that of social distancing, and that that is actually an action. And so I wanted to include that. But I'm going to go on to the activity, and I'm not going to talk too much about it. I think it's a pretty simple activity. But I had this idea that when we're looking at, what our students can do in this time period, what kind of agency can we help them find? And one is by creating a time capsule is how we usually call it, but I'm going to call it an archive. It gives them a sense of being able to tell their own history. Right now, this is a particularly historic moment, and they are experiencing something that young people have not experienced in 100 years, since the 1918 epidemic. And so by teaching them what an archive is, by teaching them, reinforcing what primary source documents are, and having them realize that they can create the primary source document for today. It could be a poem, a drawing, a photograph, a local news article, anything that either they create or that they find in their space that represents to them what they are personally experiencing during the virus. Obviously, there has to be some, there might be some fictionalization on the students' parts, just because some of their situations might be so dire that they don't want to share it. And that's, of course, understandable. And that's the discretion that, of course, you would take as an educator. My idea is that whatever they do, hopefully most kids have a camera and can snap a photo and send it to you of whatever it is, if it's a poem, whatever, and so that there can be a digital copy. I'm not sure, but I think that would be reasonable enough to ask. Then they would also send you just a brief explanation of why that artifact or that document was what they chose to put into this archive of the time. Next, if you assemble the documents using Google Slides, and if your district is using Microsoft, then you would use, an online version of PowerPoint. But you would then share the link with your students after you put all the documents together in the slide. And then that kind of constitutes the digital archive for your class for this era. And then asking them to go back and reflect, like, are there other documents that should be in this archive to tell their story of 10th graders in April 2020? And so they need to analyze the archive to make sure it's complete, tell you why or why not it's not, and then summarize the story that they think might be told about them 100 years from now, based on what a historian who's looking at these documents ascertains. And so that's kind of another kind of basic way that we can integrate issues students are dealing with right now with lessons that we learn from genocide education without going too much into the trauma of genocide itself, given the level of trauma students are experiencing right now. So in your toolbar, I'm going to place, once I close out the PowerPoint, I'm going to put a link to a Google folder. And in that folder, there's going to be a list of documents and resources for you to use in the classroom. They're going to have a summary of the genocide, the framework, a brief history of the Armenian Genocide. They're going to have different lesson plans, including the Tulip Gardens one that we covered. They're also going to have videos and testimony, as well as a PowerPoint and written survivor testimony. If you go to our website, this is an image of genocideeducation.org, you're going to find additional lessons, survivor accounts, videos, documents, books. These are just examples of some of the things we offer. And these are additional resources. This particular one, The Promise, actually, if you tune in about after we're finished with this, if you want to jump over to the Armenian National Committee website, the Armenian National Committee Facebook page, you can actually participate or listen to a conversation between the producer and director of The Promise and members of the Armenian community. The Promise came out 2 years ago. It's a phenomenal film, low on nudity, well, no nudity, and no significant profanity, and really designed in a way that's content appropriate for high school students. It is long. I don't know what your parameters are right now. It's available on Amazon, streaming for, I think, just a couple dollars. And it will give a really solid, historically based background to the Armenian Genocide. Another video that we're really excited to tell you about that we just found out yesterday is available through Canopy. And if you're not familiar with Canopy, it is an absolutely amazing documentary software system that is available through the LA public library system. All you need is your library card to sign on, and you can watch Other Side at Home. Michelle has actually already seen this. The filmmaker came to one of our face-to-face workshops last year. And The Other Side at Home tells an amazing story of a young Armenian woman who goes to Turkey at the eve of the 100th anniversary and meets a woman who's Turkish, but finds out that her grandmother was actually Armenian. And so it shows the struggle of a woman contending with the fact that she was raised to basically hate Armenians, and then to find out that's who she is. actually, I'll do this last page before I go to the additional materials. Something to be aware of is that do try to use specific websites that we provide or other organizations like the Shoah Foundation or Facing History and Ourselves provide. Because of the denial issue, there's a real problem with denialist materials on Wikipedia. The number of denialist sites is always shifting and changing, but always out there. And travel sites tend to be paid for, or people who create travel sites and tend to take money from foreign governments to attract tourism and therefore reflect the political ideologies of those governments. And so in the case of the Armenian genocide, oftentimes Armenians are misrepresented in Turkish travel sites.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I think you gave teachers and hopefully soon enough students a lot to think about. A couple of questions came in that I do want to just respond to, even though I wish we had more time about this. First is about the Armenian diaspora. So yes, of course, because of the Armenian genocide, the few 100,000 maybe Armenians that were able to escape death were strewn all over the world. Of course, the first ones who were sent out to the Syrian desert, actually, when the war was over and they were no longer threatened by the Turks, they established communities there. Unfortunately, now with the Syrian civil war, Armenians have been targeted there, and there's been another mass exodus from Syria and many other parts of the Middle East, which were the first places that the Armenian diaspora, the Armenian genocide survivors went to, because all of those areas have experienced civil war since then, whether it's Lebanon or Iraq or Iran, etc. So, and then of course, and the French government was very helpful at the time in helping take in many survivors. The same for the United States. So, and that's why now in the United States, we've got the most after Russia, actually, of diaspora Armenians, and the most in the US being in Glendale in the LA area. We've got maybe 1 million or so in the United States. The other question was, why does the Turkish government still deny? There are many, many answers to this, but I can give you two important ones. One is the fact that they would be concerned about any reparations that they owe Armenians. Then the second being that, you know, the founders of the current Republic of Turkey were actually the perpetrators of the genocide, many of them. And so, of course, they would be the first to deny. And then you've got 105 years after that. And as my mom used to tell me, you know, the longer and longer that you lie about something, the harder it is to reverse it. And also, the Turkish people and government revere the Ottoman Empire. They're very, very proud of the Ottoman Empire. So a stain on the Ottoman Empire like a genocide would be very, very hard to accept. But there are slowly some aspects of the society in Turkey that do that. For those who please contact us if you would like more access to the promise, etc., and call upon us for anything. And in these days with online teaching, you know, Sarah and I and Dikran are all Armenian genocide survivor descendants. We have our own personal stories about how our grandparents were able to escape and their survival stories. And if that's of interest to you as guests via Skype or Zoom with your students, we're happy to see if that can be arranged. As well as other locals in your area that could do the same. Thank you very much. I'm going to turn this back over to Michelle. Michelle?
Yeah, thank you so much, Dikran, Sarah, and Roxanne. What a fabulous presentation. I've heard you speak many times. I learned something new every time. Just very powerful. Sarah, I really appreciate too your activities and ideas concerning the current pandemic we're all living through. This is very personal and to have students engaged in testimonies and creating possible monuments. I thought that was really impressive. Just want to thank all of you again for hanging in here. We went a little longer than we thought. This was an experiment, but as I mentioned, this will be edited down. It's recorded. It's going to be posted along with the other links and materials, and I will send that information to you through the OMS, through the same system in which you registered. I can imagine that some of the video pieces and whatnot would be very useful in your classroom too. And you can tell these folks, this is a lifelong passion and commitment to get this story out. And so we're very grateful to you and all your colleagues and everyone at the Genocide Education Project for the great work you're doing. And thank you, teachers, for making this alive and part of your curriculum. Be safe, be well, stay in touch, all right? Big hand. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you.